Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back with another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have absolutely nothing to see here, and that's posted by Baton13. That looks like a comic from Sophie LaBelle, Reddit's favorite transgender diaper fetishist who got caught using models of pictures of real babies as models for her fetish art. So let's see what that comic says. Horst Wessel was a young stormtrooper recognized as a skilled public speaker by the Nazi Party. He also wrote the song that became the party's anthem and then the German co-national anthem until 1945. In 1930, his landlady hired two men who happened to be communists to a victim over unpaid rent and alleged sex trafficking. He died in the fight. Goebbels, the Nazi chief propagandist, had been looking for someone to turn into a Christian martyr for the party. In Trump enrollment, he turned Wessel's funeral into a major propaganda event full of speeches antagonizing leftists. Thinking about him today for no particular reason, and it's a picture of the State Farm Stadium, and it has the Charlie Kirk Memorial Service banner on it. And yeah, that just goes to show you, Reddit. They're like, oh, we gotta turn down the temperature and stop having so much political violence. But then they keep saying, oh, anyone who dissents at me from me at all is a Nazi and needs to be treated as such. And that just goes to show you we're pretty much beyond the point where we can lower the temperature at this point. I would say, ultimately, if you want to call anyone who dissents at all from you a Nazi, that's fine. You should have freedom of speech to say whatever you want to. But if that being said, at some point, constant rhetoric like that is just going to lead to more of violence and assassinations. But, that's just kind of what Reddit is at this point. I'm sure whenever the GOP says the Dems are communists, I don't really care for that either, but definitely seems to be less than the left constantly calling anyone on the right a Nazi. And yeah, as I said earlier, you should have free speech to say whatever you want to. If you want to compare the GOP to the Nazi Party of the 30s and 40s, that's fine. But with that being said, I do think it's kind of irresponsible when it comes to, when you're also saying, oh, we need to lower the temperature, but anyone who dissents from me at all is literally Hitler. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have outside the stadium entrance for Charlie Kirk's memorial, followers quickly transformed clean streets into a trash-filled zone with constant medical emergencies, posted by Donald Key, and that's a cross post from the Mayor McShee's subreddit. And yeah, of course, Reddit's gonna go over everything bad they see that they think the Republicans do, but they'd never go over anything bad with that the Democrats do. I could take a picture of a lot of trash-filled streets in the city near me in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and say, oh, this is the Democrats' fault, and it would be downvoted and probably removed. But the Republicans do it, and it's the worst thing ever. And that's just going to show you, as I always say in pretty much every episode of these podcasts these days, they don't have any values, only teams. If they care so much about trash-laden streets, what about all the trash-laden streets of U.S. cities run by the Democrats? But that would be going after the in-group rather than the out-group, and that's a huge no-no when it comes to Reddit. Next we have Charlie Kirk's death, the reaction from the right, and the media coverage. Just some thoughts posted by Mundane Image 13, and they said, I believe the reason for the outrage over Kirk's death is due to a couple of factors. The biggest one being that many people on the right identified with Kirk on some level. Kirk wasn't a politician. He was just some dude out there speaking his mind, and he did so under the guise of free speech and debate. It doesn't matter whether he wasn't debating in good faith, only whether he was conservative and self-identified as Christian, and he sounded smart when saying things that the right agreed with. So assassination hit the right harder than any other assassination because Kirk was more relatable. When Melissa Hortman and her husband were assassinated in their home, the right and most of the media didn't give it the coverage it deserved because too many people couldn't dismiss it as being part of being a politician. As much the right complains about a left bias in the media, it seems to me that perhaps the right has a bigger hold on the media than they admit. Anyways, just a fault. Y'all have a good night. And yeah, personally, I think it's interesting how a lot of leftists always use Melissa Hortman as a gotcha. I think I remember one guy looked at all the Twitter accounts who were saying, "Oh, you care so much about Charlie Kirk stuff. What about Melissa Hortman?" And none of them mentioned Melissa, and none of the accounts mentioned Melissa Hortman prior to her death. And that just goes to show you, Reddit only cares about Melissa Hortman so they can use her as a gotcha to Charlie Kirk and say, "Oh, see, political violence happens on both sides." And yeah, it just goes to show you that Reddit, they have no values other than your side bad, my side good, and yeah, it just goes, Reddit, if they want to think Charlie Kirk's death was completely justified, I think that I personally would disagree. But regardless, I do think it's definitely different as this person wrote that Kirk wasn't a politician; he was just some dude out there speaking his mind. You could argue that I've run for office more times than I think he ever did, and if people do want to like him, that's fine. And yeah, I personally, I do think he was kind of on the fundamentalist side, but regardless, I definitely do think it just goes to show you how if it were up to the average redditor, I'm sure we'd have a lot more Charlie Kirks lining the streets in body bags, because Reddit, they think anyone who dissents at all seems to be Nazi. So if it yeah, then that's my thoughts there. Next we have Truth, Justice, and Declassification. Secret archives show how U.S. helped Argentine military wage dirty war that killed 30,000 from theconversation.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and that's crosspost from the History subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't really, the U.S. has done a ton of shady shit over the years, so this definitely strikes me as par for the course in regards to that. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then next we have the White House justifies abolishing the Department of Education as a measure to combat communist woke culture and threatens to cut state education funding if schools do not promote ideological thoughts such as patriotism. And that's posted from Ragnar OKXG, and that's crosswords from the Cringe TikTok subreddit. And yeah, personally, I do think that we should get rid of the Department of Education and get rid of the government and shrink the government as a whole. But on Reddit, that's literally fascism. On Reddit, any dissent at all is literally fascism, no matter how justified that the fascist comparisons may be. And that if it just goes to show you that this subreddit isn't in any ways at all meaningfully libertarian. Most libertarians believe in shrinking the federal government, getting rid of the Department of Education. But of course, Reddit, since it's Stephen Miller saying get rid of the Department of Education, it's literally fascism, even though fascism is pretty much having as big a government as possible, and the Department of Education, getting rid of it would make the government smaller. Reddit doesn't care that that's inherently contradictory. They'll justify whatever the narrative says. It's just like how they say, oh, Trump is literally Hitler, but we need to ban guns. It just goes to show you that they'll follow whatever the narrative is, even if it's inherently contradictory. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have Fiscal Conservatives in Action, posted by CH4Locks, and that's a crosspost from the Cult Headquarters subreddit. First picks of the USC White House. And yeah, personally, I think the turning the White House into a giant UFC ring is not that fiscally responsible. I'd agree with the poster on that. But regardless, the politicians have always tried to keep people distracted with bread and circuses, and that goes back all the way to pretty much the invention of the state in general. And the only difference is that Trump tends to be more obvious about it than a lot of the politicians that preceded him. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Welp, not even a memorial event could stop Grindr from crashing, and that's what's from Ragnar OKXD, and that looks like a screenshot of the down detector, Grindr outage and reported problems map, and it looks like there's a big red dot over the Phoenix area where Charlie Kirk's funeral was held. And yeah, I think it's interesting how Reddit always says whenever there's a Republican event like the RNC or now Charlie Kirk's funeral, oh, Grindr's crashing, and it's pretty much saying, oh, all the Republicans are secretly gay. And it's interesting, it's like you can't make gay jokes anymore without Reddit coming after you for it. But Reddit always seems to joke about how, oh, all the Republicans are secretly gay, and it's that's completely justified in their view, even though it's an inherent contradiction. It's like you can't make gay jokes anymore except for Republicans are gay, and that just goes to show you, as I was talking earlier about all the contradictions of the leftist worldview. That's another one that I would say that they have. Next we have How to Make a Martyr, an analysis of the right's reaction to the murder of Charlie Kirk, posted from Luciana R. Manoba, Substack.com, posted by Luciana Manoba, and they added a chronological analysis of the over 200 right-wing ex-posts, reveals the 4-stage playbook used to turn the murder of Charlie Kirk into a tool for political retribution. And yeah, personally, I do think the right is kind of using Charlie Kirk as kind of a narrative tool. But I'm sure if it was Hassan Piker or any popular leftist streamer, I'm sure the left would be doing the same thing. And that just goes to show you how, Reddit, they seem to care more about the effects of Charlie Kirk's death than Charlie Kirk getting murdered himself. And yeah, if you want to care more about Jimmy Kimmel getting canceled and taken off the air, or Charlie Kirk's death being used to push an agenda, that's fine. But don't tell me that, I care about political violence first and foremost, and then when it comes to political violence, you try and downplay it while going after it, while saying, they're using Charlie Kirk's death to push something else. Well, you yourself are also using it to, try and push something else. I would argue, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Jimmy Kimmel Live to return to air Tuesday after suspension for Charlie Kirk comments, ABC says, from news.yahoo.com, posted by Plasman 30, and they said, I guess all those people canceling their Disney Plus, Hulu, and ESPN Plus finally worked. I love when the free market works. And yeah, personally, I think it's interesting how Reddit's like, the FCC canceled Jimmy Kimmel, and now Disney's just putting him back on the air. It's like, it's interesting. If Trump's literally as powerful as Hitler and the Nazis, how can they be putting Jimmy Kimmel back on the air? And yeah, personally, I don't really care for Jimmy Kimmel at all. I said it's in a comment on the Political Compass Mean subreddit recently. If the Orange Man was smart, he'd have gone after Reddit instead of Kimmel. It's pretty much just a platform of millions of him. Well, probably thousands and millions of bots, that is. But regardless, I do think the Trump and the FCC shouldn't have been as open about pushing Jimmy Kimmel off the air. It's only going to make them look bad in comparison, even if I think Jimmy Kimmel is nothing but an MSNBC-style propagandist at this point, rather than a comedian. And yeah, personally, I do think, it might just be ABC trying to get points among progressives saying, we had to cancel Jimmy Kimmel, but now we're bringing him back. And that just goes to show you that, Reddit hates big business, but when big business capitulates to whatever their demands is, suddenly it's not so bad anymore. It's like they hate McDonald's, but then McDonald's tweets out trans rights, and suddenly, they're not so bad anymore. And it's interesting how, Reddit says, I don't like corporate authoritarianism, but they always completely justify whatever corporate authoritarianism that Reddit itself does. And it just goes to show you, they have no principles other than you will obey whatever I tell you to, and without dissent at all, or else I'll moan about it. And yeah, that just seems to be a lot of politics these days, no questioning whatever the narrative is, just obey. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have, after cuts to food stamps, Trump administration ends government's annual report on hunger in America from Denver7.com, posted by Maddie O'Clock, and they added, this is just simply blatant dictator behavior, full stop. And yeah, personally, Reddit's always going to say Trump's Hitler, Trump's a fascist, but, I personally think, if they want to get rid of any government reports, that's on them. Personally, I think there's too many government reports. I think we need more private reports rather than public reports funded by public taxpayer dollars. And of course Reddit, so they're always going to use it as anything as an excuse to push Orange Man bad. That's pretty much all Reddit is at this point. It's the constant circle jerk of Republicans bad, Orange Man bad, even on supposedly non-political subreddits, and it just gets tiring after a while. That's why I didn't like Biden staying here that much either. But at the very least, there was at least they added Biden Democrats good post in there as well, which I didn't care for those either, but at least it wasn't every post literally being Republicans bad / Orange Man bad, and that's my thoughts there. Then we have This Is Fine, posted by CH4Locks, and that's a cross post from the inflation subreddit. The dollar is collapsing. And yeah, this is just Reddit. It's more Reddit. It looks like a chart from the Financial Times. U.S. dollar is having its worst year in decades. And yeah, I think this is more Reddit doomerism. Reddit's always going to be like, our society's collapsing. But eventually, when it comes, it's like with The Boy Who Cried Wolf or Chicken Little, you can't constantly yell the sky is falling without people, starting to get numb to it all. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have MAGA is a cult. Observers slam Charlie Kirk at memorial as weird and embarrassing, posted by from allstory.com, posted by Donald Key. And yeah, personally, I do think it was a little more on the flamboyant side, I would say. I would agree with that. But, I'm sure that if it was a progressive getting killed like Hassan Piker, Reddit would probably have the same kind of Reddit would think the funeral was the greatest thing ever if it was for him. And yeah, personally, I don't really like it how the GOP used it as a political event, but the Dems are going to use all their things as political events as well. So ultimately, it's just that Reddit only cares since it's the out group running the funeral rather than the in group. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Libertarian National Committee formally censures New Hampshire affiliate from independentpoliticalreport.com, and that's a crosspost from that's posted by Potato Palm 13. That's crosspost from the Libertarian Party USA subreddit, which I commented on, and I said, "Free speech for me, but not for thee, the Reddit classic. It's pretty much a platform of millions of Jimmy Kimmels. Shows you why he doesn't really need to be on the air anymore." And yeah, I think it's interesting how Reddit was constantly bitching about Jimmy Kimmel getting taken off the air, saying, "What about my freedom of speech?" And then here, the Libertarian National Committee is censoring, not censoring, but pretty much the step before censoring, the new Libertarian Party New Hampshire affiliate for some edgy post. I would say that, that the Libertarian Party New Hampshire does do a lot of edgy posts. I would agree with them there. And then, they're kind of like the 4chan edgelords who like to say, "Oh, we're Nazis, yada, yada, yada," or whatever. But, I personally don't care for it, but that's very much their brand at this point. And it's like, that's very good. They should be censored. And it just goes to show you, Reddit has when it comes to free speech, it's very much free speech for me, but not for thee. And yeah, it's interesting, for them, the biggest free speech thing over the Charlie Kirk murder was Jimmy Kimmel getting taken off the air, not Charlie Kirk getting murdered and permanently censored forever. And that just goes to show you how, Reddit only cares about free speech when it's for them. Otherwise it's hate speech or misinformation or whatever they want to label it, and they'll justify censoring it and removing it and banning you entirely in some instances. And yeah, they see no hypocrisy at all there. It just goes to show you that, it's all just very much the same in-group good, out-group bad thing that everything on Reddit is at this point. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And then we have, as Trump pushes to unseat Massey, why have no challengers entered the race, from CourierJournal.com, posted by Donald Key, and that's crosspost from the Thomas Massey subreddit. And yeah, hopefully that no one will unseat Massey, but I personally, if I were Massey, I personally wouldn't be picking fights with Trump. If you pick fights with Trump, you usually find a way to come after you and make you irrelevant, like Jeff Flake or Liz Cheney. And yeah, that's why I personally think Ron Paul plays it smarter, not antagonizing Trump too much while still calling me out occasionally. But yeah, I do like how Massey is standing up for his principles. That's really not something that you see too much in politics these days. And yeah, I personally don't like to vote for either of the major parties. I have done since 2022. But I do think if Massey gets the GOP nomination in 2028, I might have to make an exception for that rule. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And I think we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.